So in this short video, we're going to go over the Budapest Memorandum. We're going to try to understand what it does and does not say, or does and doesn't require of Russia or the United States, or so on and so forth. Okay, so as we go through this, I'm going to kind of guide you through this. My name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to offer context in the war in Ukraine. I've done more than 1,000 videos about Ukraine at this point, and it's only December 13th of 2023 as I'm speaking. I focus on leadership. My PhD is in organizational leadership, and I try to focus on what the different players are doing. So I don't do the battle maps, but I also have a master's in public policy, and so going through something like this is going to be pretty easy. By the time we're done, you're going to understand what the obligations are and are not of the Budapest Memorandum. So let's start here with this article in Radio Free Europe in February 28th of 2014. Budapest Memorandum and its relevance to Crimea. So that was the topic at the time. This was well before the 2022 invasion. What exactly is the Budapest Memorandum? The Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances is a diplomatic memorandum that was signed in December 1994 by Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. It's not a treaty as most treaties are, it's just a memorandum of understanding between these few nations. Okay, it's not a formal treaty, but rather a diplomatic document under which signatories made promises to each other as part of the denuclearization of the former Soviet republics after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So the idea was, if Ukraine will give up its nukes, then the US, the UK, and Russia will all guarantee its sovereign borders. Now, we're not very far after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so it's only 1991 to 1994, so it's still like Ukraine may have still been looking at us like, well, we don't know if we trust you, the United States, or we don't know if we trust you, United Kingdom, and I guess by this point they kind of really didn't trust Russia, but nonetheless, they're getting these big players as signatories to guarantee their sovereign borders that we would not cross, that these nations would not if they gave up their nuclear weapons. Under the memorandum, Ukraine promised to remove all Soviet-era nuclear weapons from its territory, send them to disarmament facilities in Russia, and sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Ukraine kept these promises. Now, as I understand, what actually happened was Ukraine had the nukes, but the codes were back in Moscow. Would Ukraine have been able to cut that off and then figure out how to create the codes? Probably. Ukraine's pretty smart, but at the time they weren't able to use them anyway. They thought this was a good idea. We'll get these guarantees. We'll be our own sovereign place over here, and we won't have to deal with nuclear weapons. The US and other countries around the world thought it's better to have fewer countries with nuclear weapons than more countries, and so this was a good idea. That's what we thought in the mid-90s. In return, Russia and the Western signatory countries essentially consecrated the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine as an independent state. They did so by applying the principles of territorial integrity and non-intervention in 1975 Helsinki Final Act, a Cold War-era treaty signed by 35 states, including the Soviet Union, to an independent post-Soviet Ukraine. So again, what we're trying to do is make sure that, so when they talk about rolling back to the 1991 borders, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum was guaranteeing the 1991 borders. So that's where those dates, particularly why they're important. Okay, which principles in the Helsinki Final Act reiterated the Budapest Memorandum are relevant to the current situation in Crimea? Now, again, by the time this is written, the Russians are trying to take Crimea and make it part of Russia. In the Budapest Memorandum, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States promised that none of them would ever threaten or use force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. They also pledged that none of them would ever use economic coercion to subordinate Ukraine to their own interests. It's something that Russia has violated multiple times. The US and UK have never violated. They specifically pledged that they would refrain from making each other's territory the object of military occupation. Okay. Is there anything legally binding about the Budapest Memorandum? Now, that's the million-dollar question. It's actually a complex question. It's binding in international law, but that doesn't mean that it has any means of enforcement. So they made this agreement. Russia has broken the agreement and said, make me not do it. That's what really has happened. So we're left to falling back on the force of arms in order to uphold an agreement that they should have upheld, which leads to the question: can you make a deal with the Russians if they've already broken this agreement multiple times? Okay, let's go and find the Budapest Memorandum itself. So if you just Google Budapest Memorandum, you'll find the first thing that pops up is the United Nations Treaty Collection. And if you click on that, you'll get this on the United Nations website. And then if you go down to text documents and click on that, you'll get this actual document. It's 16 pages long and it's written in multiple languages, 3 or 4 different languages, so that you can see it, and it's not very long, so it's about 4 pages worth of actual text itself. Okay, the Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Okay, so it says this: Ukraine, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America, welcoming the accession of Ukraine to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state, taking into account that the commitment of Ukraine to eliminate all their nuclear weapons from its territory within a specified period of time, noting the changes in the worldwide security situation, including the end of the Cold War, which have brought about conditions for deep reductions in nuclear forces, confirmed the following. So who are the players? The US, the UK, and Russia are the big 3 players here. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America. Now, this is the Russian Federation. This isn't the USSR making the deal. This is the current Russian Federation. So they can't go back and say, well, you know, the Soviets, they made that deal, but we didn't. No, this is Russia. Okay, reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of CSCE Final Act to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. Okay, so the US has upheld that, the UK has upheld that, Russia has violated in 2014, violated again in 2022. Okay, the Russian Federation, and you could argue that the Russian Federation has violated earlier than that. They violated in monkeying the elections in 2004, and then ongoing since then. Okay, the Russian Federation and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the United States of America reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Again, Russia's violated. Of course, they've argued that this was self-defense. They had to preemptively act because the Nazis in Ukraine were about to go, do something to Russian citizens, or NATO, or was going to come after them, or whatever. Okay, so they made arguments, flimsy arguments in my estimation, about self-defense, but really not self-defense. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of CSCE Final Act to refrain from economic coercion, so we're not going to economically try to drive them into the ground, designed to subordinate to their own interest the exercise of Ukraine of the rights inherent in its sovereignty and thus to secure any advantage of any kind. So we're not going to economically try to sanction them into oblivion or work them in such a way that they have to be dependent on us as a vassal state. The Russian Federation, United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, United States of America reaffirmed their commitment to seek immediate United Nations Security Council action to provide assistance to Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapon state party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons if Ukraine should become the victim of an act of aggression or of an object of threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. Okay, so far that hasn't happened. I don't think it will happen, at least not in this conflict. I don't think I think Russia knows better not to do that. The Russian Federation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the United States of America reaffirm, in the case of Ukraine, their commitment not to use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapon state party to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, except in the case of attack on themselves, their territories or dependent territories, their armed forces, or their allies by such a state in association or alliance with a nuclear weapon state. And then finally, Ukraine, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and Northern Ireland and the United States of America will consult in the event of a situation which raises the question concerning these commitments. This memorandum will become applicable upon signature, signed in 4 copies having equal validity in Ukrainian, English, and Russian languages. Okay, so what have we seen here in this document? We saw that the United States, the UK, and Russia all guarantee its sovereign borders. We, these 3 parties, will not violate you. We will not do it economically. We will not attack you militarily. We will not use nuclear weapons. And we see that Russia has violated at least 2 of those with economic and military intervention, and the military intervention multiple times. Now, where does this leave us? This does not mean that the United States has guaranteed that it will come to their aid and defense in every situation. The appeal is to the United Nations in case something happens, but there's still a moral question. If we were working with them in order to reduce those weapons so that this would be off the table, we kind of have an obligation, in my mind, to be able to help them, especially when one of the signatories to the treaty has wantonly violated that. The second thing is that if a signatory of that treaty has violated that, well, not treaty, treaty is the wrong word, of this memorandum, but it's still legally binding, it just has no enforcement mechanism. If one of the signatories has wantonly violated that, why would you trust them to make a deal now? And so that's why this is going to be decided on the battlefield. You cannot make a deal with somebody who's already shown you that they've broken a deal. You wouldn't trust someone who's been known to be a proven liar. Like, you wouldn't take their word moving forward. And this is where Ukraine is now. But is it a deal that requires the United States to act on their behalf? No. Should they morally? Yes. There's a difference between those two. In the same way that there's a difference between having an enforcement mechanism and having an obligation, even if there is no enforcement mechanism. There is a difference, but the Russians still never should have invaded, or invaded back in 2014, or applied this economic pressure in order to subordinate Ukraine and try to bring them into the fold. Okay, so I hope that helps you understand the nature of the Budapest Memorandum and what's all entailed. It's pretty simple. The document, the summary of the document, the text is pretty easy to understand. When the Russians talk, they totally ignore the Budapest Memorandum and talk about, well, what about Minsk? Ukraine didn't uphold Minsk. Well, neither did you, but that's not the point. Let's go back to the founding document here. The Budapest Memorandum was violated and violated and violated again. So what you did after the violations and try to stiff arm Ukraine into some other kind of agreement, I don't know. It doesn't seem like you're a trustworthy counterpart. Okay, tell me what you think about this. You can put it in the comments below. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you more than anything else for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. If you made it this far, you really care about Ukraine.